This is a situation in which I, a strong atheist, am going to actually critique rather heavily positions that have been espoused by famous other atheists of the present day with regard to death. Notable exemplars of this position can be found both in print, say such individuals as Sam Harris, the neuroscientist, and on YouTube with famous personalities like Thunderfoot, QualiaSoup, TheraminTrees, stefbot, whose real name is Stefan Molyneux, who have all made statements about death that I deeply disagree with. In effect, they've stated that, one, death is necessary to give life meaning because only the finite is meaningful, and by the fact that life comes to an end, it motivates humans to accomplish great things. And two, that the destruction of old life is needed to give way to new life. They have also stated that indefinite life is essentially a religious fantasy, and I have to challenge them on all of these points. I think the easiest one to address is the religious fantasy point. The reaction here is understandable, though ultimately not justified. They are in essence reacting against a common religious notion of an eternal afterlife, often one of bliss, after one dies in the so-called present life. And the idea of an afterlife is indeed empirically unsubstantiated, and moreover, one can legitimately identify other flaws with it. Issues such as, would it really be desirable to spend all of one's time in heaven glorifying God? The adherents of the afterlife theory might say, well, God is so great that once you're in heaven, that's all you want to do. Glorify him. I would probably find such an afterlife to be somewhat frustrating, if not insufferable. So I can sympathize here. But the position of material, physical, indefinite life, an indefinite extension of this life in this world, without any kind of assumption that there is any other world besides this world, is very different from the religious position. And I think these famous atheists throw out the metaphorical baby with the bathwater when they dismiss the entire promise of indefinite life simply because that promise has been somewhat mutated within common religious frameworks. Indeed, I think one could trace the chain of causation the other way. Why is it that so many religious frameworks have incorporated the promise of eternal life into their systems? It is because that promise in itself is so intuitively attractive to people, and for good reason. A lot of religious frameworks exploit that into achieving financial well-being and power and influence for their elites. It's similar to the way many religions exploit the idea of morality, the idea that there are more desirable ways to live, that some ways of living are better than others. And these religious systems claim to be the guardians and sources of morality, when in fact morality can exist quite well without them. This, I believe, is a very similar phenomenon. Now, on the question of the finitude of life, granting it meaning, I consider this to be a deeply flawed and somewhat unimaginative argument. The idea here, and this idea is implicit rather than explicit, is that one cannot be motivated without external pressure, that something has to be pushing on you, imposing strict deadlines in order for you to get things done, and in order for you to improve yourself and derive meaning from life. Now, I can also understand how this idea would be psychologically appealing. After all, in school, most students are procrastinators, and I've spoken to many of them. They seem to think that only rigid deadlines motivate them to do their homework. Otherwise, they would just push everything off indefinitely. When I was in school, I was very different. I was what one could call an anti-procrastinator. My impulse, whenever something was assigned, would be to get it done as early as possible so that I could get it out of my way and move on to bigger and better things. And I found something rather interesting. When I was a student in school, my energy and motivation to get something done was in fact directly proportional to how far away the deadline was. Because if something was due tomorrow, I would feel a paralyzing urgency, this impending pressure that really stunts one's ability to think in a thorough, well-considered, leisurely fashion. If something was due in 2 weeks or a month, I knew that I could take all the time in the world, and I would do an excellent job. And I think the pervasive prevalence of tight deadlines in our society really warps the thinking of many people. As early as the earliest grades of school, this highly regimented, deadline-driven society, where the deadlines aren't anything dictated by the laws of nature, by the laws of physics or biology, but rather are artificially imposed constraints from other humans. This society leads people to develop an addiction to deadlines, and to believe that they can't get anything done without them, because their time competes for all of these deadlines. Something that is very urgent will take precedence over something that is more remote in the future. And when there are so many activities and so many deadlines, one starts to think that the only reason why one does anything is because there is some tight deadline looming. This, I think, is the basis for the argument that a finite span of existence is what motivates people. I do not see anything inherent in human beings that would justify this interpretation. I consider this mostly a cultural artifact, and hopefully one that will disappear in a saner society. In my view, having longer lifespans and having lifespans of indefinite longevity will greatly broaden the perspectives of human beings and will lead them to consider phenomena that would today simply be outside of their scope of awareness because it's very unlikely for a given individual to encounter them in their lifetimes. For instance, the Earth's magnetic pole shifts every few 100,000 years or so, and today most people don't consider what would they do in that kind of situation. The cycle of ice ages has recurred in relatively recent history every 100,000 years or so. Most people alive today wouldn't consider how life on Earth would change in case of another ice age, or how to prevent one. Every once in a while, large meteors hit the Earth and pose substantial dangers to the life on it, but the frequency isn't so great that most people can expect to encounter a meteor doing any serious damage within their lifetimes. By living longer, human beings will have a much broader awareness of these kinds of perils. They will also have a much broader awareness of the long-term impacts of their actions. In my Eliminating Death video series, I used the analogy of compound interest. If you have a compound interest earning account and you put in, say, a nominal sum, a few $1,000s, it doesn't really matter from the standpoint of your well-being whether you let that money sit in the account for 2 years or for 3 years. The difference in interest would be negligible. But if you let it sit for 5,000 years versus 4,999 years, the difference in interest would be astronomical. And so your incentive, if you knew you had that much time, would be to start putting money into that compound interest earning account as soon as possible. Likewise, some people are concerned about long-term effects of pollution. For a human being who lives for 70 years or 90 years, it's possible that a particular polluting activity may not be of much concern. And so there could be cases of individuals and businesses acting in a short-term fashion without care for the ultimate long-term consequences. But if a person lives for 500 years or 1,000 years and gets to live in a world that suffers the long-term consequences of certain kinds of pollution, then I'm sure that there would be an incentive to pollute less. For all this talk of preserving the planet for future generations, I think most people would find that unpersuasive. And I don't agree with the controls that are imposed in the name of future generations to attempt to prevent people from polluting. If you want people not to pollute in certain ways, then they need to voluntarily choose not to pollute out of their own thoroughly considered long-term self-interest. The only way to do that is to extend their lifespans. Now, the other argument that these famous atheists present with regard to how old life needs to disappear in order for new life to emerge, I consider that to be the most fallacious of the three principal arguments that I addressed today. The immediate retort to that argument would be, well, why can't they coexist? Why can't you have the old life and the new life together? Wouldn't it be wonderful to see how they interact? And as long as all of these forms of life are peaceful and don't annihilate one another, all you get is a richer world, more experiences to draw on, more variation to explore. Who says that the new life is automatically better than the old? Probably both the old and the new would be better if they got to interact with one another more. Consider that any given generation today will only ever have access to about 6 other generations at most, the 3 before them and the 3 after them. And this is actually not much of a pool of experience to draw upon, because at most those 7 generations will span about 2 centuries. For reference, that would be the time period from 1800 to 2000. If you consider the world of 1800 versus the world of 11 years ago, certainly there have been many changes, and changes in perspective as well. But a person exposed to only those perspectives would miss so much. That person would miss the perspectives of antiquity, of the Middle Ages, of the Renaissance, of the Enlightenment, and of course of all of the future eras that we can only speculate about, but that surely will be dramatically and remarkably different from anything that has come before. So it really limits the potential development of human beings in any given generation to only be able to interact with their immediate or near immediate predecessors and successors. I'm sure I could have a very interesting philosophical discussion with Aristotle or with Benjamin Franklin if I ever got to meet them, but alas, I will not. And moreover, this argument that old life needs to disappear to give way to new life is fallacious because it assumes a finite pie of resources, a finite substrate, so to speak, on which life can flourish. And for freethinkers, especially for people who are favorably inclined toward technology, markets, and progress, this seems really strange. It's strange because it ignores the impact of technology in greatly amplifying the substrate of life. Consider that in primitive Paleolithic hunter-gatherer societies, the Earth could only support about 1 million people. That is what was enough when the only resources people had were what they could hunt and forage and gather off of the land. With the agricultural revolution, with the industrial revolution, with the biotechnology revolution, the number of people the Earth could support has skyrocketed, even though the amount of space on the planet has not increased. The amount of habitable space certainly has, and it will continue to do so. I can envision even greater advances in food production and distribution. I can envision cities in space or under the sea. I can envision more efficient use of space on land, colonization of areas that are currently uninhabitable. Deserts and mountains could be transformed into human habitats, and this will require a lot of research, a lot of hard work, and a lot of advanced technology that we do not have yet. But all of this is certainly in line with the precedent of progress that has been established throughout history. And to suggest that everything that exists now has to be bulldozed by the march of time in order to make room for whatever will come next is simply unwarranted by the facts. You could have put all of the people who were alive on Earth during the first 99,000 years of human existence, and the number probably would still not be equal to the current population of the Earth. And if you put all of those people on the Earth today, they would have survived if they had today's technology. Likewise, it's very possible that with future technology, you could take all of the people who had ever lived up to the year 2300 or the year 3000, and you would be able to comfortably accommodate them in some future human environment. Ultimately, though, exposing fallacies aside, I think these famous atheists, Thunderfoot and QualiaSoup and stefbot and Sam Harris, simply have a bit of a way to go toward what I would consider genuine radicalism. Now, this is a very ambitious assertion for me to make, and when making it, I don't mean to denigrate any of these individuals, because I do have great respect for them, and I think they have important and valuable insights from which I have definitely learned a lot over the previous years. But if you may recall my previous broadcast of this series called Genuine Radicalism, it's not too difficult to locate individuals who think in terms of fundamentals in one area of human thought or endeavor. There is a fair number of principled atheists or principled free market advocates or principled advocates of indefinite life extension. What is very difficult to find are individuals who are radicals across spheres, who can take this thinking in terms of fundamentals and apply it not to just one departure from the status quo, like atheism, but rather to think systematically about how all of these spheres of human endeavor interrelate. When I think about human life extension, I think about it not just in the context of, well, what would it be like if no human beings had maximum limits on their lifespans in today's society as we have it right now? What I think about is the interrelationship of all of the factors factors that could bring human civilization to the point where there is indefinite life extension. This includes economic and technological factors. This includes cultural and intellectual factors. Surely, it will take more than biological progress to get us there. It will take improvements in political systems so that innovations aren't throttled or subsidized out of existence. It will take progress in our infrastructure, in computing, in energy, in physics. It will take deep intellectual progress, movement away from the concept of faith, of belief in the absence of evidence, and toward the concept of reason, of justification for one's beliefs, and of a recognition that wishing will not make it so. It will take a dramatic transformation of existing ways of thinking. All of the power hierarchies that are presently in existence will need to dwindle away. If you introduced indefinite life wholesale into the present world, every major government and religious organization and cultural organization would quash it. And even the forward-thinking individuals of our time might probably rally behind it. But if all of these factors evolve simultaneously and influence one another, then the world in which indefinite life will come about will be a very different world. And it is a failure of imagination to discount this kind of world ever emerging. It will not be a world where current religious conceptions of the afterlife will be embraced, but it will be a world where this fundamental human desire, this desire that is quite legitimate and quite understandable, because it is a desire for life itself, this desire will be fulfilled. And the greatest barrier to human flourishing so far, a barrier that in all societies and in all cultures human beings have struggled to overcome, unsuccessfully up to now, will finally be breached. If that is not an amazing goal to strive toward, and to devote all of the efforts of one's rational thinking within a realistic context toward, then I don't know what is. And my message to those atheists who seem to simply conceive of a desirable society as the current society with a little bit more atheism infused into it would be to think more broadly. And I know that many of these people love science and technology, so why not recognize one of the ways in which science and technology can dramatically improve our lives? Surely this is an ongoing process. It's not like this process is going to start in 10 or 20 years. This process has been happening ever since human beings started using technology, ever since lifespans were extended from the miserably short amount that was typical of the Paleolithic era. And above all, don't just be reactive to other fallacious belief systems. Just because one can recognize that a particular religious system is flawed doesn't mean that everything about that system is undesirable. This is the same mistake that atheists who become nihilists make. They reject the idea of morality because so many religious systems have laid claim to that idea. Well, I think it's a pretty good and useful idea, and that's why these religions have tried to co-opt it. I say win it back. Claim it as something that belongs in a future civilization of reason. Likewise with the idea of not dying. Why do religions get to have a monopoly on that idea? It's quite a nice idea on its own. Think, not just in terms of the present, but in terms of what could be, and how to work toward it, and how to perhaps make your life a lot richer and more meaningful than it could ever be under present-day assumptions and constraints.